Jenna Bainbridge. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So excited that you're here in this space. For anybody who does not know you, who are you today?
My name is Jenna Bainbridge. I am an actor. I am also a very passionate disability rights advocate and the co founder of the consulting company ConsultAbility, which works with theater companies to make them more accessible.
It's so cool. I remember when I stumbled upon your work and I was like, okay, wait, now I need to watch all of this and everything that you're doing. And so to have you in this space to talk about all of that and everything is just a privilege. And I am so grateful that you're willing to go on this journey um, here in this space with us. I would love to start at the beginning and just like your origin story as an artist, your origin story for why you have continued to be so active in this particular space. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh, my origin story. Um, I I grew up. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and I sustained a spinal cord injury when I was 16 months old. So I am partially paralyzed from the waist down. Um, and I now identify as an ambulatory wheelchair user, meaning that like I use a wheelchair. I am also able to walk. But my wheelchair really provides freedom for me. It allows
Mhm.
me to move faster through the world, easier through the world, move through the world without fear of tripping and falling, but also of, I get fatigued very easily when I walk. So my wheelchair affords me a lot of freedom in the world. As a kid, though, I never used my wheelchair
Mhm.
unless I like had to, unless I was told like, no, 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 this is a moment where mom's making me,
Yeah.
um, because I had kind of internalized a lot of ableism, um, and felt like walking was the goal, and
Yeah.
so I walked everywhere. Um, and when I walk, I have a very pronounced limp, um, and I loved sports. And I played a lot of sports as a
Mhm.
kid. I was in softball, I was in volleyball, and I was in karate. I got my black belt when I was 12. Like I
Yes.
was a sports kid.
Okay, black belt.
Um, yeah. And like I loved competing, I loved watching, but I really loved teamwork. I loved having a team. I loved having a common goal and having like something active to do for a couple
Yeah.
hours each week. Um, and as sports became more and more competitive, as I got to be in like middle school,
Mhm.
um, it became a really unsafe environment for me. So as much as I loved doing it, suddenly coaches and parents and other students were less willing to have me
Yeah.
on teams with them, even though I was good.
Yeah.
Like even though I am highly competitive, I have very good hand-eye coordination,
Yeah.
but I'm not a good runner. I'm
Yeah.
never going to be a good runner. Um, and people, as it became like a less and less safe environment, my mom started seeing this, and I love my mom so much because she never once was like, "Hey, maybe we should stop."
Mhm.
What she did instead was said, "Hey, look at this door over here. Doesn't this
Mm.
seem fun?" And if I had said like, "No, I want to keep playing volleyball," I know my mom would have been like, "Great, we're going to find
Yeah.
a safe place for you to play volleyball." Um, but there was one incident in particular that I didn't learn about until like years after the fact. But when I was playing volleyball as a kid, um, apparently, I don't know if it was like a coach or a parent, but an adult on the other team apparently said, "Hit it to the crippled girl." And that was the moment where my mom was like, "This
Mm-mm.
is not this is
Mm-mm.
not a safe place for my child to be."
Yeah.
Um, and so I had been taking dance classes and voice lessons, and really loved performing in that outlet as well. And so my mom started looking around and had me audition for, I asked if I wanted to audition for a couple of community theater productions. Um, and then eventually we found Family, which is a theater company in Denver that casts entirely actors with disabilities.
So cool.
And they do a summer show every year. Now they do a full season of programming, but at the time it was just a summer show, a summer musical. And my mom found that and she was like, "Hey, what do you think? Should we go see it? Do you want to
Yeah.
audition?" And that became my home. And
Wow.
I just completely fell in love. And the things that I loved about sports, I was still getting in theater. It was
Yeah.
super active. I had teamwork. I had, all of these things that I loved, um, but without a lot of the negative
Yeah.
connotations. And the thing about family in particular too is that my disability was something beautiful and something to be embraced
Mhm.
and something to be loved and not something that made me a hindrance to my teammates.
Yeah.
Um, which also then just changed my own perspective about
Yeah.
disability and how I felt about myself. And um, it meant that I became very proud of who I was and
Yeah.
very comfortable with my disability. Um, and then from family, I just started auditioning for more and more places, and it eventually led me to being in New York, and now I'm performing in Suffs on Broadway. And 10-year-old me would have never thought I would
Yeah.
go into theater at all, but then 15-year-old me would have never thought it would have ended at Broadway.
Yeah.
So it's been a wonderful ride.
Thank you for sharing all of that, and also your mom is a rock star. Like,
My
your
mom
mom
is the best.
because I mean, first of all, I'm not a parent other than to my dog, which I take very seriously, but it's not the same, obviously. There are
Right,
many
right,
ways to
right.
parent, and to
Mhm.
do so in a way that empowers your child and
Mhm.
never makes them feel other in their eyes, to
Yes.
consistently uplift and show what's possible. Like, even
Mhm.
just thinking about, now versus then, like when we were growing up, like how that must have even been harder, that like even just I think about all of
Yeah.
that and how your mother being so proactive in not making you, it seems, and please tell me if I'm wrong, like
Mhm.
making you ever feel like you were the quote unquote problem. It was everyone else and the
Correct.
system, and boo
Yeah, and it
on
was
them.
society.
Exactly. Let's like find you are deserving of all of it. Of course, period. End of story. They suck. Let's find
Mhm.
you a space where you can be surrounded by people who are accepting and hold values that are akin to ours. Like,
Yes.
what beautiful mothering.
Yes. And both my parents were always that way.
Yeah.
Both my parents were always like, "Yes, Jenna has a disability,
Yeah.
and yes, that doesn't mean that I shouldn't do
Correct.
all of the things that I want to
Correct.
do and shouldn't have the childhood that every other kid has."
Correct.
And, like, so when I was 4, I was using a walker at the time, and I told my mom I wanted to be a ballerina. And, like, I just know so many parents who their kid would, their 4-year-old using a walker would say, "I wanna be a ballerina." And they'd be like, "Oh, honey,
"Oh,
that's not"
sweetie." Yeah, exactly.
right, or, like, try to divert them or
Mhm.
encourage them not to do it or, belittle them in some way. And my mom said, "Okay, great." And she and my dad went in search of a dance company that would accept a disabled dancer.
It's amazing.
And I was 4 years old, and she called I don't know how many dance companies, and finally found one that was not only accepting, but excited. And it was
Wow.
Debbie Stark at Kaleidoscope Dance, and she was my dance teacher for many years.
Yes.
Um, and, those things, like, it took so much extra work for them to make sure that I was in places that were accepting of me.
Yeah.
But it also meant that I myself never knew a world that wasn't accepting of me. Like,
Yeah.
yes, there was ableism, and yes, I was going to be facing that, but it also meant that I was still able to get the experiences that I wanted and the training I wanted. Um, and I don't think a lot of people are able to do that.
Yeah.
Parents aren't necessarily able to do that, and I don't necessarily think that society tells us that we should do that.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I
that's my
really
next
applaud them.
question. Like, I feel in many ways, and it's so relative, but in many ways it sounds like it was a privilege, which feels
Mhm,
so strange to say because there are so many folks who I would imagine don't have parents or resources or somebody who's advocating on their behalf in such a
mhm,
profound way.
yeah.
How have you found, as you've navigated more in your adult life and certainly with consultability, how have you been able to find ways to like bridge that for folks? have you not? Have you seen? I just mean that in more like maybe even like a visual way of like when you're seeing some space that you're like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I think that access is such an interesting conversation because there's a difference between making something accessible and making something inclusive or equitable.
talk more about
And
that.
so when I go into a theater and we're talking about access, I like to point out, here is how you can make something accessible, right? Here's how you can make sure that people with disabilities are able to access your art.
Okay.
However, if that access means that they are, I'm gonna use an example. We performed at the Tony Awards this year, Suffs
Yeah.
did, and the Lincoln Center uh, wasn't fully wheelchair accessible to get from where they were going to drop off the cast members to the stage access. Like their regular path was
Yeah.
not accessible. So the accessible path involved me being dropped off at a different location and taking a fully, no stepless access to backstage. There wasn't a way to do it, but it meant I was separated from the cast,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's accessible, but that's not equitable,
Right.
right? Because part of the deal is you want to be able to have the same experience
Correct.
as the other people around you. So an accessible seat might, if you're going to a theater, might be, oh yes, this seat doesn't have any steps and you can roll right up to it, but it's partial view because it's
Right.
way over on the side, right? So it's accessible, but it's not equitable. So one of the things that we do when we come in as ConsultAbility is we show them like, here's the minimum for making something accessible. And that's often as far as people want to go. It's just like, I made it accessible. Great. I checked my box.
Is that because they think that that's the minimum and that's all they're able to do? Is that because they don't want to go above and beyond? Is that because it's normal for people to just be like, oh, if I do something that's accessible, then I've done something great? Like, why are people only interested in capping?
I think it's a little bit of all of those things.
Okay.
The big one that we hear the most is cost,
Okay.
right? Is, oh, we can't afford to make these seats accessible, right? Um, because people think of access as costing money because it's on individual companies to create access. It's not necessarily built into the buildings. It requires renovation. Um, but when you make something accessible, 20% of the population has a disability of some kind.
Yeah.
And we think of accessibility as wheelchair users because
Mhm.
the international symbol for access is a person in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
But disability goes far beyond wheelchair use. Disability, as a category, only 7% or something like that of disabled people use a wheelchair.
Mhm.
So there is a much larger conversation about what is accessible, and what is access. And I think people think of access as like no stairs.
Right.
And access is actually making sure that it's accessible to people who are neurodivergent, people who are blind, people who are
Mhm.
deaf, people who have mobility impairments that maybe aren't wheelchair use. There's so many subcategories, and I think that people get overwhelmed when they're thinking about like all access, and so they
Mhm.
check the box of, well, what does the ADA require?
Uh-huh.
And ADA requirements are often just the very basic, like ADA requirements are actually supposed to be the minimum,
Mhm.
but it has become kind of a checklist that people think that they can just be like, great, I met the requirements. I'm done.
Yeah.
Because it can be overwhelming to enter the world and think, well, what are all of the disabilities?
Yeah.
And how can I make this accessible to everybody? So I think that it's a little bit of everything that you said, but I think the big one is just that people don't necessarily realize that something is inequitable.
Mhm.
If they see that something is accessible, they go, great, we did it. And people don't necessarily take the time then to think about, well, what if I were using that seat,
Yeah.
right? Would I be happy with that experience?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is the bigger conversation. And that's what we really try to tackle at ConsultAbility is it's not just that we're going to come into your theater and tell you, oh, hey, you need to add, 3 more wheelchair accessible seats. And here's a captioning and audio description system for you to use. And, make sure that all of your mirrors and sinks are at this height. Okay, great. Bye.
Mhm.
What we're really doing is we try to go in and do anti-ableism trainings and conversations so that it becomes a holistic view of accessibility so that the individuals then have the tools that if we're not there at the
Yeah.
next renovation, they now hopefully value access and anti-ableism as a concept, and it becomes built into the ethos of a theater.
Yeah.
And that goes far beyond, great, we have an accessible path, and goes to, we are going to make sure that instead of just that one person takes the accessible path, that becomes the path for everybody.
Yeah.
Every person is having the same experience, and experience is equitable. And that way, I could stay with my cast
Yeah.
for the Tony Awards, right? Like,
Yeah.
what a concept.
Yeah. 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 When you go into these spaces with consultability specifically, are you pitching to an organization being like, hey, we've noticed that you may need our assistance? Or is it more like they on their own are like, we are realizing we actually, as we're either renovating or we're growing, we need assistance with this and we don't know how to navigate this kind of space. Let's hire these folks at Consultability to come in and have a conversation. Or is it both?
It's a little bit of both, and it kind of depends on our bandwidth as
Yeah.
consultability. Like, if we are going out and seeking work, um, versus if we're just passively kind of, making sure that we're able to keep up with the
Yeah.
work that we have. Um, and so it has been both, and both are successful models. Sometimes we reach out to companies because we hear, like, hi, we heard that you're, doing a production that might feature characters with disabilities, or, we heard from somebody who worked there that this is something that needs to be addressed. But more often than not, most of the clients that we have actually come to us and say, we are noticing that this is a need that we have, and we want to make sure that we are making this an accessible, inclusive, and equitable experience for actors, designers, technicians, audience
Yeah.
members, employees, the whole building. Because the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the Americans with Disabilities Act really only impacts public spaces. And so private backstage spaces, employee areas aren't actually protected by the ADA.
That's wild.
So when you're building a theater, there are places that are just fully inaccessible, even in brand new spaces.
That's wild.
Um, so if it, that is the conversations that we get into, is, we want to make sure this is a truly equitable experience,
Yeah.
and we're realizing that we can't do that on our own. We need to have conversations and training, and figure out where those pitfalls are.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like, hire y'all to then have these trainings, but like, what are some of the major touch points when you go into these spaces and you're doing a training? What are some of the things that you have found more often than not are the consistent, like, these things are absent, or these are the
Mhm.
conversations that are not really being had, or this is such a simple way for you to begin even in putting this into practice that is so often absent, that seems so obvious but maybe is forgotten? Like, what are some of
Yeah,
those things?
yeah. I mean, the first thing that we really try to address is just like saying that disability is not a bad word.
Yeah.
Disability, disabled, these are not bad words. People often get very anxious about, like, even asking questions about disability, because it comes, I feel like it comes from a good place. I think it's that people don't want to offend
Yeah,
anybody.
for sure.
But if we can't even say the word, then we're not going to have any kind of important or impactful conversation.
With
So,
that, are there certain folks that you have found that actually prefer something else more inclusive,
oh,
or
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. It's, disability, by, like, the word itself, just like any other community, we all have our own opinions about what words we
yeah,
like and what language we prefer. Disability and disabled are two words that are not going to offend anybody,
mhm,
right? Those are the chosen words. Um, Other people are going to have other identities,
okay,
absolutely, but this is like the fail-safe word that you can use. I like to say disability or accessible, right?
mhm,
So, like, if you're talking about parking, right? Where's the accessible parking,
mhm,
or where's the disabled parking, are
mhm,
both completely fine to say. What's not great to say is where's the handicap parking.
right.
Even though, like, all of the government signs say handicap is actually a rather offensive
Well,
word.
because it comes at a deficit. We're saying that there's something wrong with you rather than it's
Yeah,
different than what we know.
and the origins of the word
Mhm,
literally come from people holding their hats out, their caps out, for money.
yeah,
Like, it's the idea that, like, disabled people can only survive through handouts.
Yeah.
So like it just has a lot of really negative connotations and a lot of really negative history to it. So just try not to say
Yeah.
handicap, right? There are so many, you can say accessible, disabled, these are all fine, wheelchair accessible, like, there's so
Mhm.
many other words you can use. So that's one of the first things we really address is like, let's just acknowledge that the elephant in the room and ask questions about disability and say disability.
Okay.
Um, because that's the first thing is that access is different for every single person. Every single person has different access needs, which becomes our next point, which is that access needs are human needs.
Mhm.
There is nothing specific about disability to access needs
Yeah.
because every person has access needs. We have access needs every day. Maybe the access needs are I didn't get enough sleep last night and now I have a headache
Yeah.
and it's going to be harder for me to do my job today because of that. Right? Maybe my access needs are like I am hungry right now, right? Like maybe the access needs are I twisted my ankle yesterday, right? Like
Yeah.
everyone has access needs that change, and disability is a part of that.
Yeah.
So having those conversations about like, what are your access needs? That is not a bad conversation,
Yeah.
right? And it's not asking like, hi, what's your medical history? Can you please tell me your trauma? Like, it's not that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's saying like, you can say, you know, what do you need? What are your access needs? Do you have a disability that we need to be accommodating for? Like those are all normal conversations. And people are
Mhm.
so afraid to ask those
Mhm.
that one, people tend to assume.
Right.
So like one of the assumptions about me is because I use a wheelchair that I am not able to walk or stand,
Mhm.
which is not the case for me, but is not the case for every single wheelchair user,
Right.
right? It has to be a conversation of like, what's going to be best for you. So if I say, hi, I need wheelchair accessible seating, if I'm calling a theater, there needs to be a conversation there of, would you like to stay in your wheelchair? Would you like to transfer to a different seat? Would you prefer to be, facing head on to the theater? Is a view on the side okay? Right? Like these are conversations that need to happen, but it also requires a certain level of awareness of disabilities
Yeah.
in
Well, I
order to
think that
have
you're
those
bringing up
conversations.
something very real, which is I think for many folks, there's a very specific lens of unless your disability is so visual,
Mm-hmm.
I don't even like I'm not even going to imagine that it could be anything that say isn't or the
Mm-hmm.
understanding, yeah, as you're like beautifully of course eloquently saying about like disability is so much larger than what we have an understanding for just given like the little signs of say a little wheelchair on a door like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
what exactly is our understanding of disability and how inclusive is it in terms of like the spectrum of emotional, mental,
Yes.
physical, and all of the intersections of all of those for
Yes.
sure. Yeah.
And it's also just like a reminder that every single person will become disabled at some point in their life,
Mhm.
or they'll die before it happens. Like disability is inevitable, it's part of the human experience. And there are aspects of disability that we as a culture have completely normalized. Like one of my favorite examples is wearing glasses.
Mhm.
Glasses are an assistive device.
Yeah.
If you were not wearing glasses, you would not be able to interact with the world the way you currently do,
Yeah.
right? Like, and glasses are normalized now. But before we had that, if you were going to a show, if you were acting in a show, you would have requirements, right? You would have assisted needs. You would have
Yeah.
like all of these things are such a normal thing. And I think about that all the time when I'm entering spaces of some people might have assisted devices that they're able to interact with the world without assistance, like
Mhm.
glasses. But what if they don't have their glasses that day? What if their glasses broke that day?
Right.
Right? What if
Mhm.
we need to then meet people where they're at on that day?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so you're having these conversations, and then from there, is it more like, okay, this kind of paperwork needs to happen? Is it more like we need to bring in these kinds of folks to actually implement physical changes into your physical spaces? Like, what are some of the ways that you end up finding the next step of assistance for these theaters, for example, ends up being?
So it kind of depends on how their day goes.
Okay.
Generally, when we do an audit of a space, so what we like to do is do a training so that people are aware of where their own ableism might be and
Mhm.
also what things they can currently be combating to like view the world through a different lens and a more accessible lens. Then we go audit the spaces And when we're doing that, we're always thinking about what are solutions. And generally, we try to provide those solutions as part of the audit of,
Yeah.
well, we give them paperwork afterwards. It says like, we try to give an option of a short-term solution and a long-term solution,
Mm,
an inexpensive or free solution, and a more expensive like renovation solution.
amazing.
Um, so like one of my favorite examples was we went to a theater that wanted to make a backstage restroom accessible. They didn't have any accessible restrooms backstage. Um, and we went in and looked at the space and we realized that the bathroom itself was actually a decent size. It wouldn't accommodate every single person. It wasn't ADA compliant,
Mhm.
but we figured out if they changed the swing of the door so it swung out of the room instead of into the room,
Mhm.
it could accommodate a large percentage of people.
Okay.
So if they just changed the swing of the door and added some grab bars, which you can get at Home Depot for cheap,
Mhm.
and it's a theater, so of course you've got like countless people who
Yeah.
are totally equipped to install those. This is a solution for changing the swing of the door and adding some grab bars is a solution for a couple $100.
Yeah.
That means that that restroom becomes more accessible to a larger percentage of people. And then the long-term solution is when you renovate, make this ADA compliant. In the meantime, we know you can't afford to renovate,
Mhm.
but in the short term, for a couple $100, you can make this accessible to, 90% of
Yeah.
disabled individuals,
Yeah.
right? Which is a big step up.
Huge.
Um, so we try to give those types of solutions. And sometimes it's, sorry, we don't have a solution for this. You will have to eventually renovate. But then what the solution is disclosing that to people,
Okay.
right? So once again, just coming back to me, because it's always better for me to speak in I
Yeah.
statements. If I am hired by a theater and they know I am a wheelchair user, and this has happened to me many, many times, I'll get a phone call that says, "Hi, like we're so excited for you to come, or we really want to offer you a contract, but before we do, we need you to know we do not have a wheelchair accessible restroom." Right? And then I can ask those questions
Yeah.
of, what does that mean? Like, how big is it? Are there grab bars? You know, all of the little questions in between. And then I can decide for myself if that's a safe environment for me to be in.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes the answer is going to be no.
Yeah.
But oftentimes the answer is, well, if we did XYZ thing to accommodate, then I could use that restroom.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe the solution is, can we put some curtains up around the outside and like have somebody there to make sure nobody comes in so I can use the restroom so it's big enough for me to be in?
Yeah.
Or is the solution for like me personally, all right, I'm able to stand and walk, so I will just stand and walk. I won't have my wheelchair with me in the restroom. Right? There are
Yeah.
other solutions, but they involve conversations,
Yeah.
and people have to feel comfortable enough having those conversations.
I also hear though that obviously through the work that you do and also starting as a young kid who had somebody who was advocating for you that you are quite adept at advocating for yourself,
Yes,
which is amazing.
but not
And
and not the case for everybody.
exactly. And so I guess I wonder for folks who are listening who really are resonating with what you're saying and they do not
Mhm,
feel as empowered within themselves, they don't have
mhm.
the tools accessible yet for themselves of how to advocate for themselves when these conversations happen. Also, just because, like, as artists, we're told to stay small, just generally, like, we're told to stay
Yes,
small and not make anything difficult and, like, you take what
yes.
you can get and the scarcity of it all. So, just
Mhm.
even at baseline for most of us starting out is like, we don't even feel like we can take up that space
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
throw on somebody who has a disability that they need these things in order to make this
Mhm.
process work. How have you found some of these beautifully creative ideas? Is it through your own experience of working at ConsultAbility? Is it just like your own
Mhm.
life stuff? Or where can people begin to think creatively about these solutions for themselves from the theater perspective and also more specifically for artists advocating on behalf of themselves?
Yeah. I think that for me, so many of these things came from my own trial and error of
Mhm.
knowing what works for me. And I always found that very helpful for me. It doesn't work for everybody to be able to, if I'm learning choreography, saying to a choreographer, "Oh, yeah, that move doesn't work for me. It's not going to be
Yeah.
sustainable for me." It's hard to say. It's hard to say
Yeah.
like, "No, I can't do that." Because you're right. Like as actors, we want to be like, "Yes, and thank you. I'll take this crumb. I'm really
Right.
grateful." But sometimes that's not what's going to benefit us in the long run. So what I have found for myself is being able to say, I can't do that. Could I do this instead?
Okay.
Giving solutions has been very helpful for me. But once again, that takes knowing myself and takes
Yeah.
being able to advocate for myself. The other thing that I found very helpful was finding other allies in the room.
Okay.
So, because sometimes it's easier to advocate on behalf of somebody else,
Yeah, for
right? Like,
sure.
even like we've all had that where it's like, well, I'm not going to ask for this change, but I see my friend struggling,
Yeah.
right? And if that person has a relationship with the choreographer and says like, hey, some people are having trouble with this dance move. Like sometimes that's the conversation, and oftentimes people are very open to that conversation. Um, so having other allies and advocates is sometimes one of the best things you can do. Like I've countless times gone to friends and been like, I don't have the energy
Yeah.
to ask for this thing. So like, could you say something on my behalf?
Mhm.
And that can be very helpful. And sometimes they say like, I don't have the bandwidth either, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But having other people that you can go to and having other relationships, like trust your relationships, trust the people that you have in your life.
Mhm.
And then I also have a manager who is really, really wonderful at advocating for me. Um, and finally, like you can also reach out to companies like ConsultAbility. There are other companies like ours, and we have done that for productions where
Okay.
they have been hiring people with disabilities, and we have been with the production from start to finish as consultants to be there as the advocates.
Yeah.
Because it should never, in an ideal world, we should never have to be our own advocates. That
Yeah.
should be somebody else's job so that we can just show up and do the work. Um, so we have done that for productions in the past where we just are on for the whole run. We come into rehearsals regularly. We are available to anybody in the company, not just disabled company
Yeah.
members, to make sure that their access needs are being met.
Yeah.
And it is something that is available to everybody. You
Yeah.
are able to reach out to third parties who can contact the company and say like, this is a problem.
Yeah.
That can also feel hard and scary, and
Mhm.
I acknowledge that. It's hard to advocate for ourselves, but it's a much easier when we have relationships that we trust.
Yeah. I'm thinking also to 2 different episodes that we've had in our past 2 seasons. One is with Ali B. Gori, who is visually impaired as an
Hmm.
actor and activist, and in our conversation, she mentions some, I guess you would call it like the preliminary paperwork that even just like simply asking some questions, about accessibility and
Yes.
needs of artists, that might be really helpful. Also, just the episode that we had with Kira Troilo, which talked just generally about EDI and how she comes in to
Hmm.
talk more holistically about that with, companies and theaters and individuals and
Hmm.
some of the tools that are very like minimal, but accessible from the start. What are some of the things that you have found might be wonderful ways to just get the temperature and or set the tone or space from the first day of rehearsal or even prior to that when you first get the job that artists, individuals, theaters can implement from the get that doesn't require any sort of finances and is really
Hmm.
maybe just some paperwork or conversations that initially will already set the stage?
Yeah. I always I like to just get a sense of like what is the state of accessibility at the company, and so sometimes I will send an email beforehand that's just like, "Hi, I'm super excited to start rehearsal. I just wanted to know what's the setup,
Yeah.
right? Like, can you just tell me, where are the dressing rooms? What are the bathrooms? What are the showers? And asking those basic questions like what my access needs are.
Okay.
And sometimes I'll add specifics of like, are there grab bars? Is there completely stepless access from here to here? Like, and the answer can be no,
Right.
right? The answer can like, and that's actually a good thing because what it does is it lets the theater think ahead of time.
Transparency.
So it's not
Yeah.
exactly, it's transparency and it's knowing ahead of time so that we have runway to make accommodations, right? The worst thing is to be surprised
Yeah.
by a lack of access, is to show up and be like, oh my gosh, there's 3 stairs into this building and nobody told me,
Yeah.
right? If I know that ahead of time, then I can make those accommodations for myself. We can work out a plan that, I enter through a different door or that someone's there to meet me or that we've
But I'm
had the
still
time, the
hearing that
intolerance.
you're the one who's
I'm the one
advocating
doing
for
it.
this,
Yep.
like
But what it is sometimes the theaters do it themselves, right?
okay.
Because if you go to them and you say, "Hi, what's the situation?" They might frequently, they go, "Oh, we hadn't thought about this.
Yeah.
Okay, great, we're finding a solution now." So that it's not me showing up and
Yep.
making the solution. It's the theater realizing it for themselves because, people don't always think about access. It's not part of our awareness.
Yeah.
So
Then
saying, "Hi, can I, just wanted to check in about access. Is it going to be wheelchair accessible?" That's the only question. Then it's on them to tell me if that's going to be the case. And I
yeah.
have found that to be, you know, it works most of the time. Some of the time,
Yeah.
sometimes there still are going to be problems, but at least I'm more aware of what I'll be facing.
Okay.
And the theaters are more aware that it's going to be a need.
Okay.
Um, what I would love for theaters to do is to to take a day and walk through their spaces
Mhm.
and just write down all of the potential accessibility problems.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that ConsultAbility has been working with Actors Equity with their auditing teams who go
Mhm.
and do the safety audits. And one of the things that we've been training them on is exactly this: is asking for a disclosure of access.
Yeah.
And all that is just letting people know, here's how wide the doorways are. Here's what the lighting is. There is fluorescent lighting in the bathrooms. There is a very loud beep from the fire alarm that goes off once every 2 weeks, right? Like
Yeah.
these things that might be inaccessible for people and just disclosing them,
Yeah.
because then you have the runway to ask for accommodations or for the theater themselves to say, "Oh, actually we should just change out the light bulbs and not have fluorescent lighting in
Yeah.
any of these rooms," right? But oftentimes we don't even know that there was a problem because the mentality in theater is the show must go on.
Correct.
Is I just won't complain.
Correct.
And oftentimes what our solution is, that was inaccessible for me. I just won't audition there anymore.
Yeah.
And that leads to just perpetuating the cycle where they say, "Oh, well,
Yeah.
it's worked for everybody else."
Yeah. I love this idea of I mean, obviously, again, it seems so obvious, but clearly most people and individuals and places and organizations don't necessarily do this of just like, let's walk through
Mhm.
our space and see what was just
Mhm.
it's kind of like when you're in yoga and you're just lying in shavasana and you're not doing anything, but you're just like
Mhm.
noticing, or in a body scan where you're just noticing the
Yeah, yeah,
tension in
yeah.
your body. And you're not, the intention is not to change it. It's just to be like, oh,
No, to be aware of it.
I'm holding so much tension in my shoulders, or my knees are feeling weird today. It's a
Mhm.
yes, thank you, I see, I'm here with you, body, let me send some breath.
Mhm.
It's just
Mhm.
I feel like it seems so obvious to me to be like, let me go through my space and just notate all of the things so that we have a document of what is. And frankly speaking, I would only imagine if and when, say, a theater wants to renovate, having that as a document being like, this is what was put down 5 years ago. And clearly
Mhm.
since then, it's even worse. Like it only
Right.
helps with getting A, finances, and B, like assistance when you actually want
Yes.
to put in the changes. But
Yes.
just even the awareness part of it, I feel so many it requires effort to be like,
It
somebody
does.
please walk around with a clipboard and see what is happening across all the spaces. But I wish in my mind as I'm listening that that should be something that is also sent along when you get your contract from a theater, of just like
Mhm.
the piece of paper that just outlines the space,
Yes.
of just like, and there's no judgment to it. It's like, these are the way,
No.
this is how it's laid
No, it's just
out.
the reality.
Exactly. And then then it becomes normalized of we're
Mhm.
all in transparency around what we're navigating. And then me on
Yep.
my own can advocate. And it's, I think it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, which is all of just how disability is something that is a spectrum, and that
Mhm.
sometimes it's visible and sometimes it's not. And for those folks
Yes.
who do not have a visible disability, to be able to know for themselves, and they're not
Yep.
presenting with it, they're not sharing it
And
necessarily,
they
it's
don't
not
have to disclose anything. That
exactly.
way they can just decide for themselves if this is going to work for them.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
And it gives more agency to everyone. I mean, I'm
Yes.
here for transparency, clearly, which is why I continue bringing on folks like yourself to just try to
Mhm.
demystify a lot of the things that nobody wants to talk about and are so
Yeah.
important for us to be talking about, or even just simply thinking about in the recesses of our beautiful minds. But just that one piece of paper that may take a person in the office 2 days to walk through and type
Yes.
up is
Mhm.
huge. Is
Yes, and
huge.
will save you time and effort later
Yeah.
when you might not have the time.
Yeah.
right? Like if every single theater would just like take a phone
Yeah.
and just do a video
Yes.
walkthrough of every single space,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not even saying that they need to necessarily like do the full write up then, right?
Yeah.
Just take the 10 minutes to walk through every space and
Yeah.
then just have a video that's like, here's what the dressing rooms look like.
Yeah.
Here's what housing looks like. Here's, what the bathrooms look like.
Yeah.
And then people can for themselves go and watch the video and
Love it.
listen for, oh, is there a sound trigger that I might be hearing? Oh, I see a step. I wonder if there's something being done about that. Like it does put it on the individual to watch those videos, but at
Yeah,
least
but
it's
it's
been
there.
disclosed. Yes.
Exactly.
And it means that nobody has to feel like they have to disclose
Yeah.
before they need to, right?
Yeah.
And I am a huge, huge advocate for I wish everybody would disclose their disabilities because
Mhm.
I think it actually normalizes
Yeah.
disability and it normalizes access needs. It empowers all of us to get the access needs we need.
Yeah.
I can't count the amount of times where I've been in a room and like my access needs are kind of on display
Yeah.
because I use a wheelchair. My disability is very, very visible. But what that has meant is that when then I have an accommodation that was provided for me without my asking,
Mhm.
other people sometimes go, "Oh, I need that too."
Yeah.
And it is so common.
Yeah.
Access benefits everybody.
Yeah.
The My favorite is it's called the curb cut effect. Curb cuts, which are the little ramps at curbs at
Mhm.
intersections, um, curb cuts were originally kind of a they were made by like jackhammers in the dead of night. They were not made by cities. They were made by
Okay.
individuals, like
Wow.
vigilantes, going through in the middle of the night and being like, "This step is inaccessible and it doesn't need to be here."
Wow.
And this was in Berkeley, California, in I think it was like the 70s, the
Okay.
60s. And there's a great podcast episode on 99% invisibility, all about curb cuts. But it was these activists going through and saying like, we don't need this, and we have a solution. And the city kept going and fixing all of the curbs
Wow.
until they started getting these letters from other people saying, "Oh my gosh, this is so great. I'm so glad that this little cut in the curb exists now." And it was, parents pushing strollers.
Yeah.
It was delivery drivers who had, rolling dollies and carts.
Mhm.
It was, people who were like joggers, right? That were, jogging up and down a step is much harder than just going down the
Yeah.
incline, right? So it was non-disabled people who were like, "Oh my gosh, this is so great. It's benefiting so many of us."
Yeah.
And it's really benefiting people with disabilities who don't have other options,
Yeah.
right? Access benefited everybody, but we didn't know what to ask for until we saw it. So
Yeah.
sometimes disabled people are the ones saying, "This is what I need." And then other people go, "Oh, yeah, that makes my life easier too. Yes, let's
Yeah.
continue doing this."
Yeah. That's partially like what I've been thinking the whole time, which is sometimes we don't even really know what we need until we are in it, and then we
Yes.
don't even still really know or can articulate what it is that we need until
Mhm.
it's probably too late. And even retrospectively, you're like, I know I needed something and I still don't even know what that is. I just
Yeah, and
know
I
it was
couldn't even
something.
ask for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so just even naming the fact that sometimes not knowing is okay. But
Yeah.
then I guess finding other people or allies or folks who are more well versed and being like, "Hey, in this moment, I know that this isn't feeling right for some reason, and I don't know what that is," to be able to
Yeah,
just
sometimes
simply.
voicing it is
Exactly.
enough because then
Exactly.
somebody else might be able to have that brainstorm or the brain power to be able to say,
Exactly.
like, to put it to words or to ask for what the
Yeah.
accommodation is. Like, voicing it is the first step.
Yeah. For folks who are not disabled, what are some ways
Mhm.
in our regular lives that we can be more uh, inclusive, accessible, anti-ableist, all of that?
Yes, great question. Um, First off, I feel like just diversifying our media is a great way to become more anti-ableist. Follow influencers who have disabilities and talk about disability.
Mhm.
Watching TV shows, movies, everything that has disabled performers, disabled writers, disabled characters. Um, you know, m- Making disability part of our life is a huge way to become more aware of what disability is in reality.
Yeah.
Um, so that's always just diversify your feed, make sure that disability is a part of it. I also highly recommend, if you want to do like your own intro to anti-ableism, Demystifying Disability is a fantastic book by Emily Ladau. That's a really good like intro to the world. And then from there, she also has this wonderful bibliography in the
Amazing.
back of her book of like recommended reading and watching and listening. And it's a really great way to, and Emily is also a friend of mine. And so I also feel very good about like
Yeah.
recommending her, and she's amazing. But I had read her book before I met her. It was like a very
Okay.
exciting thing where I was like, oh my gosh, you wrote the book that I've been
Yeah.
recommending for like 5 years. So she's wonderful. And that book is incredible. Great intro to anti-ableism. Um, and then just in general, like when you are with your disabled friends, when you are, working on a show with people with disabilities, when you are interacting with people with disabilities, like just don't be afraid to have an uncomfortable conversation sometimes. It's the only way we learn, it's the only way we grow. Um, More often than not, I feel like people are so scared to talk to me
Yeah.
or to ask me questions. And, I am much more comfortable talking about my disability than some people might be, but like just don't be afraid to treat us like humans and then maybe have an uncomfortable conversation sometimes.
Yeah.
And when you can, advocate for the person, right? So, like, one of the things that just is always so empowering to me is if I go out with my friends, I know that I am not going to have to research, is this restaurant accessible? Because I know my friends have already done that,
Yeah.
right? Like, those little things go a long way.
Yeah.
Um, so, be there for your friends, especially if you know someone's access needs. Just be on a lookout ahead of time. And even if you just send them a text that's like, hey, I already checked the restaurant's accessible, awesome,
Yeah.
right? Like it goes so far because that's work now that I don't have to do.
Yeah.
Um, so just kind of be aware of those things, be willing to have those conversations, um, and try to become more comfortable with disability and the fact that like we all know someone who has a disability, and we are all very likely to acquire one
Yeah.
at some point in our lives. And just
Yeah.
it's the human experience. It's normal and it's a beautiful part of
Yeah. Um, we didn't get to spend too much time on this because we had such an in-depth
life.
conversation prior to this, but I'm curious how your experience with Suffs has been.
Oh, Suffs. I love Suffs so much. I first auditioned for Suffs over 3 years ago. Um, I've been doing workshops with Suffs
Mhm.
since 2021. Um, and so to finally be doing it on Broadway is
Yeah.
just like I'm so, so proud of the entire team and of Shayna Taub, our incredible writer and star.
Mhm.
It's been amazing. And also wonderfully accessible because there are so many advocates in the room.
Amazing.
And it is also a great example of what we were saying before of like, I didn't know anybody coming into Suffs. I had never worked with anybody in the room before. Um, and day one of my first workshop, we had a very long conversation of what my accommodations might be and what my access needs were for the show. We would have daily check-ins of our access needs
Wow.
for the entire company, in that first workshop, where everyone would just say like, you know, my access needs are met, or I have access needs and they are blank. And what was great about that was that it normalized that everybody in the room had access needs.
Yeah.
Frequently I was like, my access needs are met. And, everyone's like kind of expecting for like, okay,
Yeah.
the girl in the wheelchair, she's going to have access needs. And I was always like, my needs are met.
Yeah.
So it was a great way to like enter into that space. And now it's been 3 years. And for Broadway, I knew that I was in a safe place moving into it. I knew
Mhm.
that our producers really cared about access. I knew that my director was really passionate about access. The choreographer, Shayna, of course. Like I knew that it wasn't going to be all on me,
Right.
and it was 3 years of fostering those relationships. But our team acknowledged right off the bat that the theater we are in is 100 years old,
Yeah.
is very, very out of date when it comes to like any kind of accessibility. Um, and they made it fully accessible for me. The backstage of the Music Box Theater, they built a ramp up to the stage door.
It's amazing.
Once you are in the theater, there's a ramp up to the stage level. They built a fully accessible dressing room and bathroom at stage level. Um, and these are wonderful, tangible things that now we also, because we can have people come backstage, and what it
Yeah.
has meant is that we have had numerous people with disabilities who have been
Oh,
able to come be on stage. So,
yeah.
Ali Stroker came a couple weeks ago, and it was just so exciting to be like, "Hey, Ali, you want to come backstage?"
Yeah.
Like, it's so rare that those places are accessible, um, and it's a really beautiful thing that I did not have to do that advocating. It was 3 years of friendship and relationships, and
Yeah.
people doing that work on their own to become very anti-ableist. But the show is completely accessible for me. One of the other things I love about it is that I play characters who use a wheelchair and I play characters who walk.
Mhm.
And Lee Silverman, our director, was always very open to conversations about
Yeah.
what I wanted those characters to be.
Yeah.
Um, and we built a show that also I can use my wheelchair for the entire show if I need to. So if I'm having a day where I'm like, you know what, walking is not it today,
Yeah.
um, all of my tracks are fully wheelchair accessible.
Amazing.
But also, it was important to me to show ambulatory wheelchair use, to show like I use my wheelchair and I walk. And she was so open to that too. I think I've had a lot of directors who have been like, that might confuse the audience. We're not ready to
Yeah.
open that cup of, that can of worms. And she was very much like, no, this is great. This is your reality, and we're going to do it. And it makes it feel like there's an extra person on stage,
Yeah.
because a lot of people don't realize that it's me who
Mhm.
was using the wheelchair and then walking in the very next scene, and they think there's an extra person on stage, which is never a bad thing in an
Yeah.
ensemble. Um, so it was the whole experience has been just so wonderful, and more than anything, what has been powerful to me is getting to meet so many audience members who are seeing themselves
Yeah.
represented on stage for the first time.
Yeah.
The amount of people I've met who it's their first time seeing a wheelchair user on stage. It's their first time seeing an ambulatory wheelchair user,
Mhm.
seeing somebody who walks with a limp. Like, these are not things that we see very often in our
Yeah.
media, and it's been really wonderful getting to meet people and feeling that I'm representing so many people in such a incredible show too. The show is absolutely stunning. Um, and reminds us of our own power and our own
Yeah.
ability to advocate and to fight and to affect change in the world. And so for me, being able to be a disabled person in a story about affecting change is so impactful and empowering.
Ugh, I'm so happy for you. I mean, just I'm so grateful that you took the time in this conversation. I'm so excited about all that you are representing for so many folks for the first time and for so many in many respects, which is so unfortunate, but also just like thankfully it's happening at least now. Like
Yes.
I'm really grateful that you were willing to go on this journey and be so vocal and vulnerable and honest and transparent and helpful. And I know that this conversation is going to help so many people. So thank you for going on this journey.
Oh, thank you. It's
Yeah,
been such a joy.
good.
Anytime I can talk about access, I get very excited. So,
Good. Good. Same here. For anybody who wants to reach out to ask more questions, to work with you, to hire ConsultAbility, where within your boundaries are the best ways for people to find you?
yeah. If you want to follow along with me, I am on Instagram at Bainbridge Jenna. Um, And if you are interested in ConsultAbility, uh, that Instagram is at ConsultAbility, or you can reach out to us at consultability.org, um, or our email is info@consultability.org.
Amazing. Thank you so, 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 so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.